Boone Helm wasn't the kind of man stories were exaggerated about. In fact, he was the kind of man they were toned down for, just for the sake of decency. They called him the Kentucky Cannibal, but that nickname incredibly barely scratched the surface. Boone wasn't just violent, he was more like a tornado of blood and bone ripping across the American frontier with the cold indifference of a natural disaster. He killed without remorse and fed on human flesh when the need arose, or sometimes just because he felt like it. And through it all, he carried himself with the callous swagger of a man who believed death feared him instead of the other way around. Apparently, at his execution in Virginia City, Montana, Boone stood on the gallows next to the men he'd fought alongside and turned on them without a flicker of shame. When one of them began to struggle and panic in the final moments of his life, Boone calmly leaned over and offered a few parting words, telling him, quote, "Kick away, old fellow. My turn next. I'll be in hell with you in a minute." And this wasn't bravado, this was Boone's truth. He had stared death in the eye a few hundred times and never blinked, and facing his own execution, he saw no reason to start then. He didn't fear the noose, he actually welcomed it, and if there was really a hell, he was already halfway home. Before getting too far ahead though, his story is one of the darkest ever written into the dirt of the American West. It's a tale of cruelty and chaos, of blood on the snow and madness on the trail, but beneath the horror, Boone's life reflects something larger. It was, in many ways, a reflection of the brutal lawlessness of the frontier and what becomes of a man when the wilderness sinks into his bones. This is the story of Levi Boone Helm, perhaps the most terrifying outlaw the Old West ever produced. As a warning, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Long before cannibalism, murders, and the gallows, Boone was just a boy born into a good family. He came into the world on January 28, 1828 in Lincoln County, Kentucky, and was one of 12 children born to Joseph B. Helm and Nancy Wilcox. His family was honest, hardworking, and by all accounts respectable, but Boone was the outlier. Where his parents and siblings leaned toward decency, Boone went off the road entirely. Early on, it became clear that he wasn't wired like the rest of them. When the family moved west to Missouri, Boone was still young, but the land he was raised on shaped him as much as blood ever could. This was the borderland between tame civilization and savage wilderness. At the time, it was a rough, lawless frontier where violence was a fact of life and strength was the currency. The closing days of the Santa Fe Trail were still in swing, and towns like Westport and Independence were still rampant with wagon trails, gold lust, and the anarchy that often accompanied Manifest Destiny. And Boone, who was a creature of that chaos, thrived in it. As an aside for the non-American viewers of the channel, Manifest Destiny was a quintessential American settler ideal that they were destined or even divinely ordained to expand across the North American continent, and this was often regardless of the cost to anyone or anything in their path. But anyway, Boone quickly became known for his feats of strength and reckless bravado. He'd apparently throw his Bowie knife into the ground and at full gallop lean down from horseback to retrieve it. This particular trick didn't serve any kind of purpose, it just looked dangerous and made people watch. On another occasion, when the law came calling, Boone took defiance to a whole new level by riding his horse up the steps of a courthouse and into the courtroom itself. The judge was even midsection, but Boone didn't care. He launched into a rant, verbally lashing the magistrate from the back of his horse. And this wasn't just an isolated act of rebellion, it was Boone completely distilled. He was loud, violent, showy, and above all, absolutely incapable of respecting authority. Even as a young man, he seemed to relish conflict. He wasn't just impulsive though, he was dangerous. His temper was a live fuse, and people knew to steer clear because wherever he went, trouble followed, and that trouble always escalated. He doesn't seem to have been born a monster, but by the time he hit adulthood, whatever moral compass he might have had was shattered, buried, or long since thrown in a fire. Boone was essentially born for the West, and the West, unfortunately, was born for him. For a fleeting moment in his early 20s though, Boone tried to walk the path of a settled man. And on paper, it looked almost normal. In 1851, he married 17-year-old Lucinda Frances Browning in Monroe County, Missouri. They even had a daughter together named Lucy, but it soon became clear that Boone wasn't wired for marriage or family life. By then, he had already become infamous in his community for his drinking and erratic behavior. He was also known to ride his horse into the house as if the walls didn't apply to him. And what started as simply reckless behavior quickly turned violent. He began attacking Lucinda with increasing frequency and brutality, and soon he was completely out of control, treating his home like a personal saloon and Lucinda like a punching bag. This became so severe that Lucinda, who by the way was still a teenager, did the unthinkable for a woman of her era and filed for divorce. Her decision, as brave as it was though, was more so out of necessity. Boone was tearing through their lives and she had no choice but to run. The divorce, however, would come at a heavy cost. Boone's father footed the bill to free Lucinda, spending everything he had to make it happen. This financial hit was devastating and it bankrupted him and shattered what remained of the family's reputation. Boone had completely ruined his marriage, burning every bridge he could on the way out, and he brought shame to his name, wrecked his family's finances, and made himself a pariah in his own community. And rather than take responsibility or show any remorse, Boone did what Boone always did. He packed up, turned his back on the wreckage, and set off in search of something new to destroy. The California gold rush was in full swing, and Boone saw opportunity in it. Unlike most heading west, though, he didn't do it for the riches. He went for the violence, chaos, and anonymity. And this time, he wouldn't just leave behind a family, he'd leave behind any last trace of humanity. When he set out for California, he didn't plan to go alone. He wanted company, specifically his cousin Littlebury Chute. At first, Littlebury agreed, whether it was loyalty or naivety or simply not knowing Boone all that well. He signed on for the journey, but at some point he had a change of heart. Maybe he sensed Boone's volatility, or maybe he just realized how dangerous the road ahead would be with a man like Boone by his side. But either way, he tried to back out, but this was the last decision he would ever make. Boone didn't take the rejection well at all, and in this case, his response was swift and final. Boone stabbed Littlebury in the chest, killing him almost instantly. There was no struggle or fight, it was just cold-blooded. One moment they were planning a trip, and the next, Boone was walking away from a body. Word spread fast afterward, and Littlebury's family wasn't about to let the crime go unanswered. His brother, along with a group of local men, tracked Boone down and brought him to justice, or at least they tried to. Boone had one more trick up his sleeve, which was madness. While in custody, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. Whether this was genuine mental illness or a calculated performance, Boone played the part well enough to be declared insane. Authorities then committed him to a mental asylum, but then he proceeded to manipulate everyone in sight. He kept quiet, played calm, and slowly gained the trust of one of the guards. Before long, they were taking routine walks through the woods together. This was harmless and innocent until the day Boone simply didn't come back. He vanished into the wilderness and escaped the guard and was now on the move again, westward bound with nothing tying him down. With his cousin dead and the asylum behind him, Boone began his westward journey alone, and wherever he went, death wasn't far behind. Anyone who got in his way, or even just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, risked becoming his next victim. Boone would cut a swath through the territories, leaving behind a string of violent encounters. He got into duels, started fights, and ended men's lives. And while his exact body count is lost to history, the number of deaths linked to him on that journey climbed steadily. As this was going on, and with any new people he encountered, and campfire conversations and drunken confessions, Boone let pieces of his true nature slip. He spoke of killing without hesitation, of violence as a tool, and then came the whispers of cannibalism. He admitted it casually, like someone recalling an old hunting story. He had apparently, on more than one occasion, consumed those he killed, or simply those who didn't make it. In true Boone fashion, this wasn't a boast so much as a warning. Boone didn't just kill to survive, he killed because he could, and when he ran out of food, he didn't see a body, he saw a meal. And as he went deeper into the west, the land grew wilder, and so did he, and in the winter of 1853, his depravity reached new and unforgettable depths. At the time, his latest venture saw him in the rugged mountains of eastern Oregon, part of a group of 6 men bound for Fort Hall, Idaho. Most of them were strangers, thrown together by desperation and the promise of better fortunes beyond the next mountain, but the wilderness had other plans. The party was poorly prepared for what lay ahead, and as the seasons turned, they were caught in the brutal mountain winter by deep snow, biting wind, and dwindling supplies. In the midst of this as well, the group was attacked by Native Americans, which scattered them into unfamiliar territory. They would make it as far as the Soda Springs along the Bear River in Idaho, but by then, the horses had collapsed from exhaustion and the food was long gone. So to survive, they killed the remaining horses for meat and turned their hides into crude snowshoes. Still though, one by one, the men began to die from exposure, exhaustion, and starvation until only 2 remained, Boone and a man named Burton. The 2 pressed on through the snow, but eventually Burton collapsed as well, unable to go any farther. Boone then left him in an abandoned cabin and continued toward Fort Hall, only to find it closed for the season with no food, shelter, or help in sight. So with no other choice, Boone turned back, and that's where the story turned grotesque. According to Boone, he returned to find Burton had ended things with a pistol, and ever the pragmatist, Boone then built a fire. Then he began feasting on this newly discovered meal, beginning with one of the legs. Boone then wrapped the second leg in an old shirt, slung it over his shoulder, and trudged onward into the frozen wild. He was eventually discovered at a Native American camp by a man named John W. Powell, filthy, starving, and barely human. And taking pity on him, John gave him food and clothing and an escort to Mormon settlements near Salt Lake City. John would later say that Boone was the hardest, most soulless man he'd ever encountered, and here's the kicker. Boone had been carrying in excess of $1,400 in coins the entire time. He hadn't been destitute and down on his luck. He had simply chosen to eat anything and everything when the going got tough and preferred to blend into a community where he could more easily hide his evil deeds. But in any case, when Boone and John reached the Mormon settlement, John was offered no thanks, payment, or acknowledgement. Boone simply disappeared into the settlement with a full belly, heavy pockets, and lighter one leg's worth of company. Boone had crossed a line that most men could never imagine and felt no shame in it. In fact, he'd talk about it openly for years to come, even to the point of bragging. For a short while afterward, Boone blended into frontier society, or at least lurked on its fringes. He told stories, some were funny, some were terrifying, all of them in time though, revealed more than anyone wanted to know. He was like an open wound in a chatterbox with a Bowie knife and a drinking problem. But with this immediately apparent personality, Boone quickly found work, according to some accounts, as a Danite or a so-called enforcer of Mormon justice in the early days of the church's westward expansion. Whether the title was official or just an excuse for Boone to kill with impunity is up for debate, but two men soon turned up dead and suspicion quickly fell on Boone. It wasn't long before even the Mormons realized they'd let a wolf through the gates. So just as quickly as he was hired, Boone had outlived his usefulness and his drinking escalated. His violence became more frequent, and his total lack of gratitude or restraint made him an unwelcome guest, so Boone left. Or maybe he was strongly encouraged to leave. Either way, he hit the trail again, heading back west. Sometime later, while traveling through California, Boone encountered a rancher who offered him shelter, food, and safety when he was on the run. In other words, the rancher was a kind soul, the complete opposite of the man he invited in. Boone, in turn, repaid that kindness with the only way he knew how. He robbed the man and murdered him in cold blood. Obviously, no good deed went unpunished in Boone's world. With another body behind him, Boone fled once again, this time back up north through Oregon and into the ungoverned wilds of the frontier. Along the way, he picked up a handful of new traveling companions. He drank with them, rode with them, and at some point laid bare his truth. He told this new group that he'd killed many men before and that he'd even, quote, been obliged to feed on some of them, end quote. By 1862, the gold rush had begun to shift northward, drawing fresh waves of prospectors into the mountain towns of the Idaho Territory. One such boomtown was Florence, filled with miners, drifters, and men who didn't ask too many questions. It was the perfect place for Boone to disappear into, but as was often the case, it didn't take long for him to make himself well known. This started with a saloon quarrel. Boone had been drinking heavily and got into it with a man known as Dutch Fred, who had a reputation of his own as a fighter, although he wasn't the type of man to pick fights without a cause. The two men argued and tempers flared, but the situation seemed to cool down. At least that's what Dutch Fred thought. Later, when Fred was unarmed and standing face to face with Boone, the conflict reignited. Boone then drew his pistol and fired. The first shot missed, but Fred froze long enough for Boone to get off a more carefully aimed second shot. Even in a town like Florence, where the law was more of a suggestion than a rule, Boone had crossed a line. The murder was blatant, and the motive was unclear. Some said Boone was hired to do it, others said he did it just to prove he could. But whatever the reason, it was too much even for Florence, and Boone fled again. From there, if you can believe it, the trail grows even darker and more surreal. Boone headed north into British Columbia, where he and another man were caught in yet another stretch of wilderness. Starvation set in, and once more, Boone emerged alive and alone. Witnesses later claimed that he had not only eaten his companion, but possibly attacked him for the sole purpose of doing so. By this point, it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't desperation that drove this, it was now a habit. British authorities would end up picking Boone up and, seemingly overwhelmed by the problem of what to do with him, shipped him back south. He was briefly jailed in Portland, Oregon, but that didn't last long as he once again escaped justice. Eventually, somehow, the law caught up with him again in Florence, and he was brought to trial for the murder of Dutch Fred. It looked like this might finally be it for Boone, but he had one more card to play. His brother, who was nicknamed Old Tex, arrived in town with a pocket full of money. Witnesses were then paid off and testimonies disappeared. Quickly, the case collapsed and Boone walked free. It was another narrow escape in a life full of them, and as Boone vanished from Florence for good this time, it also became increasingly clear that this was not a man who could just be caught. After dodging conviction in Florence, Boone once again vanished into the western frontier, but again also, wherever he went, people died. He drifted through Oregon, through California, always looking for the next hand to rob, the next man to kill, and the next town too scared or too disorganized to stop him. He robbed travelers and shot men in disputes. He picked fights in saloons just to feel the blood pump in his chest. And no one knows how many people Boone killed during this stretch of time, but the count was high and the motive was always the same, simply because he wanted to. But the strange part at this point in his life was that he wasn't working alone anymore. At some point, Boone became affiliated with Henry Plummer, the infamous sheriff turned outlaw who ran one of the most dangerous gangs in the West. Together with a crew of road agents, thieves, and cutthroats, Boone carved his way through the Montana Territory under Henry's wing. But Boone was never one to take orders lightly. He was unpredictable even by outlaw standards. One minute he'd be drinking with his fellow gang members, and the next he'd be accusing them of betrayal or gunning them down in the middle of a crowded street. Finally though, communities started fighting back and the idea of vigilante justice began to rise. Boone, who had somehow survived wild winters, duels, starvation, and jail cells, was suddenly on the radar of people who didn't care how dangerous he was. By late 1863, the Montana Territory was reaching a breaking point. The citizens of Virginia City had grown tired of the lawlessness, tired of burying their dead while outlaws rode free, and tired of men like Boone, so they took matters into their own hands. The Montana Vigilantes, a citizen-led group of justice dealers, decided Boone's time was up, and this time there would be no escapes, no family buyouts, and no loopholes. It took 3 men to corner Boone in the street, armed, deliberate, and fully aware that if they gave him even half a chance, he'd turn the tables on them. Boone actually didn't fight, and maybe only because he was caught off guard. He reportedly even told them that if he'd had a chance or guessed what they were up to, they'd never have taken him. Afterward, Boone, along with 4 other members of Henry's gang, was tried in secret by the vigilante court. In classic Boone fashion, he opened with a bold-faced lie. When asked about the murders, he denied everything and claimed he'd never killed a soul. He actually even swore it on a Bible. They made him do it again just to watch him perjure himself once more, but even Boone knew the charade wouldn't save him. Privately, he confessed to killing men in Missouri and California and admitted to having done time in prison. He then even tried to shift blame onto his own gang members, accusing them of the very crimes he'd committed. His so-called friends, like 3-fingered Jack Gallagher, heard every word of it, and Jack didn't take it well. His response was one of panic and denial, but his fate had already been sealed the moment he met Boone. As the men stood alongside each other on the gallows after being sentenced, Boone turned the entire thing into his own twisted comedy show. As they prepared Jack for the rope, Boone tried to grab his coat off his back, pointing out that Jack wouldn't need it anymore. When George Lane, another condemned man, jumped off his own box early, Boone watched with cold detachment and commented, quote, "There's one gone to hell," as if he was noting the weather. Then came Jack's turn. As Jack struggled with what was being placed around his neck, Boone offered a calm farewell, telling him to, quote, "kick away," before promising that he'd be in hell with Jack in a minute. A moment later, the box was kicked away from beneath Jack, and after about a minute, the same was done to Boone. Apparently as well, 6,000 people had gathered to watch the spectacle that cold January morning in 1864. And they watched Boone pass the way he lived, loud, violent, and completely unrepentant. There was no ceremony or last rites, just a cold wind, creaking ropes, and the end of one of the wildest, most depraved lives the American frontier had ever produced. But Boone wasn't just a product of misfortune or madness alone. He was something the frontier itself seemed to summon. A man like Boone couldn't have thrived in polite society, but in the raw, unsettled winds of the American West, he fit right in, almost too well. What set Boone apart wasn't just the violence, although there was plenty of it. It was the coldness and casual way he moved through life and death alike. He didn't just survive the brutality of the frontier, he became it. And yet, Boone wasn't just some lone, isolated horror. He was more of a symptom of a time and place where the law came late and life was cheap. He may have been more extreme, more flamboyant, and far more terrifying than most, but he wasn't alone. The American frontier was full of men who killed, stole, and lived by their own savage codes. Boone just didn't bother hiding it. He wore his depravity like a badge. And to top everything off, his death didn't bring closure. Rather, it brought confirmation that even in a world as violent as the Old West, Boone had managed to stand out as something worse. Today, he's just a footnote in outlaw lore, overshadowed by gunslingers with cleaner reputations and catchy nicknames. But the truth is, there was never a villain as real or as disturbing as Boone at the time. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. Also, in case you weren't already aware, if you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.